The station of KTH Solara sat in the middle of nowhere, which was exactly why everyone had agreed to build it there. It belonged to no one. It was claimed by no government and taxed by no empire. It floated in the cold dark between three star systems like a forgotten coin on a table, and for that reason every major civilization in the known galaxy used it when they needed to talk without anyone getting nervous about whose territory they were standing on. On this particular morning, the station's grand hall was full. Ambassadors and envoys from 14 different civilizations sat in the curved rows of seats that lined the hall. They were the Vilhiri, tall and silver-skinned, who communicated partly through color shifts in their neck frills. There were the Dross, short and heavy bed, wearing the thick pressure suits their species needed outside their home world. There were representatives from the mean collective, the Surath assembly, and the quiet, pale figures of the Oreth, who sat in the far back row and never spoke unless spoken to. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and whatever candle-like incense the Velhari had brought along, which they burned at every formal gathering, whether anyone else liked it or not. The hall had a high ceiling and walls that had been carved from the station's original asteroid stone, left rough and dark on purpose to give the space a sense of gravity and seriousness. It worked. Even beings who had attended hundreds of these meetings tended to sit up a little straighter inside it. At the front of the hall, a raised platform held a single podium. Standing behind it was Grand Admiral Sorvin of the Varukai Dominion. He was by almost any measure an impressive creature. The Varukai were tall and broad, built like something that had evolved specifically to make other things uncomfortable. Sorvan stood 2'1" at the shoulder, clad in ceremonial warplate that had been polished to a mirror shine and then deliberately scratched in 43 places, each scratch marking a battle won. His 4 eyes, too large, too small, arranged in a diamond across his angular face, were a deep amber color that caught the hall's lighting and seemed to glow faintly. His voice, when he spoke, was low and resonant and seemed to vibrate in the chest of anyone who heard it. He had been standing at the podium for 6 minutes without speaking, which was itself a tactic. Let the silence build, let the other species fidget, let them feel the weight of what was coming. Before it arrived, most of the ambassadors were fidgeting in the back corner of the hall at a small side table that had been set up for overflow seating. The human envoy, Marcus Hale, was eating lunch. He had arrived 20 minutes early to the session, which was unusual enough that the station's protocol officer had done a double take. Marcus had smiled pleasantly, asked if there was anywhere nearby he could get something to eat before the session started, and then returned with a flatbread sandwich wrapped in paper and a small cup of something hot that smelled like coffee, but probably wasn't, given that real coffee was extremely expensive out here on the station. He was a lean man of middle age, with short gray-brown hair and the kind of face that looked like it had seen a lot of things and decided most of them were manageable. He wore the standard dark diplomatic uniform of the United Earth Corps, which was well made but not showy, no decorations, no medals. The Varukai intelligence file on him described him as unremarkable in appearance, which was accurate, and also noted that he had served in Earth's diplomatic corps for 19 years, which the File noted without fully understanding what it meant. Marcus unwrapped the second half of his flatbread sandwich as Grand Admiral Sorvan finally began to speak. The declaration was a masterpiece of imperial ceremony. Sorvan read from a scroll, an actual physical scroll, long and dark, made from the pressed skin of some creature that no one in the hall recognized, but that everyone instinctively understood was meant to be significant. The text was read first in Hyvarukai, a language of long rolling syllables and hard consonants that sounded like something collapsing. Then it was translated by the Varukai interpreter, a nervous-looking junior officer who had clearly rehearsed this moment many times. The words were very clear. The Varukai dominion in the name of its emperor and its 43 conquered worlds and its centuries of unbroken military tradition hereby declared full state of war against the human civilization known as Earth, and all territories, colonies, stations, and vessels operating under its authority. The reasons given were territorial. Humanity had established colonies in a region the Varukai considered within their sphere of expansion, but the tone made it clear that the reasons were almost beside the point. The Varukai did not need deep reasons to declare war. They needed only to decide that something in their path was worth removing. The hall went very quiet. Velhari ambassador's neck frill turned pale, which meant fear. The Droskic Envoy was absolutely still in a way that heavy-bodied creatures often go still when their instincts are telling them not to move. Two of the lesser delegates in the middle rows leaned together and whispered urgently to each other. Someone near the front had their hands flat on their knees and was staring at the floor. Sauron let the silence sit for a moment, then looked across the room, directly at the human table. His amber eyes moved past the other ambassadors as if they weren't there. He found Marcus Hale, who was in the back corner, and he held his gaze there. Marcus was chewing. He finished chewing. He swallowed. He looked down at the sandwich in his hand, appeared to consider something briefly, and then looked up at the hall in a general way, the way a person looks up when they realize the music has stopped and they should probably pay attention. The entire hall was now watching him. 14 civilizations, dozens of ambassadors and aides and protocol officers and intelligence attaches, all of them waiting for the human representative to react to the news that his people had just been declared war upon by one of the most powerful military empires in the known galaxy. Marcus set the sandwich down on its paper wrapping. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device, checked something on its screen. Then he put it back in his pocket. He looked toward the front of the hall, not at Sorvan specifically, just at the general direction of the podium, and his expression was the expression of a person who has just been told that the building's water pressure is slightly lower than usual. Mild, present, not especially troubled. He said, okay. He picked up the sandwich again and took another bite. The Varukai interpreter blinked. He looked at his translation equipment. He looked at the Grand Admiral. He looked back at the human. He checked the translation again, certain he must have rendered the declaration incorrectly, because surely the correct translation would have produced a more appropriate response. The translation had been correct. It was the human who was wrong somehow. Grand Admiral Sorvan had stood in this hall and watched 7 different civilizations receive Declarations of war from the Varukai. Dominion, he had watched proud generals weep. He had watched a Drossic admiral, a creature that could bend iron bars, with its hands go pale and reach for a chair. He had watched the main collective senior council member faint outright and have to be carried from the room. He had learned over the years that the declaration itself was almost as powerful as any weapon, that the moment a people truly understood the Varukai were coming for them was a moment that broke something in them, some inner structure of confidence, and they never quite recovered it. He looked at the human at the back table. The human was brushing a crumb off the front of his jacket. Sorvan had read the intelligence files. He knew that humans were a relatively young spacefaring species. He knew their military was modest by galactic standards, their territory small, their colonies limited to a handful of systems. He knew they had no great alliances to call on and no ancient agreements that would bring other powers to their defense. He had expected at minimum the expression of a creature that understood its situation. He did not know what expression this was. He had no frame of reference for it. Neither, it turned out, did anyone else in the room except for the observers in the back row, who were very old and had seen many things, and who looked at the human envoy's calm face and then looked at each other very quietly. The session formally closed 20 minutes later. Delegates filed out. Vilhari ambassador caught up with Marcus in the corridor outside and touched his arm, a significant gesture for their species, one they reserved for genuine concern. Envoy, hail, she said. Are you, as your government, aware of what has just happened? Marcus tucked the last of the sandwich wrapper into a waste receptacle near the corridor wall and nodded. They will be, he said. I'll file the report when I get back to my room. We have a standing protocol for this kind of notification. The Velhari ambassador stared at him. A protocol, she repeated. Standard form mostly. Takes about 20 minutes to fill out. He smiled at her politely, the way a person smiles at a neighbor who seems worried about something they've already handled. I wouldn't worry too much. He walked back toward the diplomatic quarters. His footsteps were even and unhurried on the stone floor. The Velhari ambassador stood in the corridor for a long moment. After he was gone, her neck frill shifted through 3 colors in quick succession: confusion, then unease, then something that didn't have a clean translation in most languages, but roughly meant, I'm afraid and I am not entirely sure of what. In the grand hall, the cleaning staff moved between the rows of empty chairs. Grand Admiral Sorvan stood at the podium for a while. After everyone had left, his amber eyes looking at the back corner table where the human had been sitting. There was still a small coffee cup there, half empty, and the flattened paper wrapping of the sandwich left behind, as if the whole event had been no more than a brief interruption to an otherwise ordinary meal. He looked at it for a long time, then he told his interpreter to send a signal back to the Dominion. The fleet could begin moving. There was no reason to wait. He told himself the human's reaction meant nothing, that it was ignorance or poor translation or some cultural reflex he didn't understand. He told himself this with great confidence as he walked back to his ship. He kept telling himself this. For several weeks afterward, he told himself with slightly less confidence. Each time the signal reached Earth at 3:42 in the morning local time for Geneva, which was where the United Earth Diplomatic Office kept its main communications center. The officer on night duty, a young woman named Priya, received the encrypted packet from Envoy. Hale ran it through the standard decoder and read the contents twice. Then she made herself a cup of tea, because some situations called for tea, and sent the notification up the chain of command. By 5:00 a.m. the relevant department heads had been woken. By 6:00 a.m. the Secretary General had been briefed. By 7:00 a.m. the initial response protocols had been confirmed. The relevant military commands had received their standing orders, and the Secretary General had gone back to sleep for 2 more hours because she had a full schedule that day, and she was not going to face it exhausted. The declaration of war was real. It was being handled. That was the situation on Earth's major news networks. The story ran as the third item in the morning broadcast. The first item was a significant flooding event in the southern coastal regions that had displaced several thousand people. The second was a political dispute over trade policy that had been going on for months and showed no sign of stopping. The Varukai declaration of war came after these, introduced by a presenter who summarized it in 3 sentences, showed a brief file image of Varukai warships that had been captured by a long-range probe 2 years earlier, and then turned to a retired military analyst who said that the situation was being monitored and that Earth's defense forces were well prepared for a range of scenarios. The segment lasted 4 minutes. After it, there was a piece about a dog that had learned to open 11 different types of doors, which ran for 6 minutes and generated significantly more messages to the network's feedback line. Across the planet, most people saw the story, registered it somewhere between mild concern and background awareness, and went about their day. Some people were more worried. There were long threads on various communication networks where people discussed the situation in great detail, argued about what it meant, and offered opinions on what should be done. There were a small number of people who were genuinely frightened. There were a larger number of people who had grown up on a planet that had been through enough things: wars, plagues, near extinctions, both natural and self-inflicted, that the announcement of an external threat registered as serious, but not as the end of the world, because the world had not ended yet, despite considerable effort, and most people had somewhere deep in the back of their minds a quiet and unexamined faith that it probably wasn't going to. This was not bravery. Exactly, it wasn't even optimism. It was something harder to name, a kind of deep, ground-level stubbornness that came from being a species that had already survived itself, which is generally considered the hardest thing to survive. The UN Security Council convened the following Tuesday. This was notable, primarily because Tuesday was when they were already scheduled to meet, and nobody had felt the situation warranted calling a special session on a Monday. The meeting ran for 3 hours. Several representatives made long speeches. Coffee was consumed. There was at one point a genuine argument about wording in the formal response document that lasted 40 minutes and was ultimately resolved by a compromise that satisfied no one completely, which is the traditional sign that a democratic body has produced a workable result. The resolution authorizing military response Passed with broad support, it was not unanimous because nothing in that body ever was, but the numbers were decisive. And the mood was clear, the language was straightforward. Earth would defend itself, Earth would protect its colonies, Earth would pursue by whatever means were practical and proportionate a resolution to the conflict that served humanity's long-term interests. Someone had indeed brought donuts to the meeting. They were gone by the second hour. Back on Keth Solar, Marcus Hale filed his report, updated his expense claims. The flatbread sandwich was listed under miscellaneous diplomatic costs at a value that would later cause a minor administrative dispute about what constituted a necessary expense, and then sat down at his desk and wrote a personal message to Grand Admiral Sorvan. He thought about it for a while. Before he wrote it, he was not an impulsive man. He believed in the weight of words and in the importance of saying exactly what you meant, no more and no less. He had seen too many diplomatic crises made worse by a message that was too long, too emotional, or too clever. He wrote the message, he read it over. He made 2 small changes, then he sent it. It was not a counter-declaration of war, it was not a threat. It was not an impassioned defense of humanity's right to exist, though Marcus believed in that deeply and could have written several pages on the subject if asked. It was not a plea for negotiation, because a plea suggested weakness, and Marcus had been doing this job long enough to know that weakness was the one thing you could never show to a Varukai and expect anything useful to come from it. The message was an invoice. It was 3 pages long and formatted according to standard United Earth diplomatic billing procedures, which were themselves based on the old UN administrative template, which was itself descended from documents so old that nobody remembered their origin anymore. The invoice was itemized. It listed 1 flatbread sandwich interrupted before completion, 1 beverage allowed to go cold, 1 scheduled afternoon session of personal reading time lost, 1 potential nap also lost. There were line items for the cost of the emotional inconvenience caused to the Vilhari ambassador, whom Marcus noted had been visibly distressed and would likely need additional diplomatic support in coming weeks. There was a line item for the use of the KTH Solara Hall without prior written notice from the Varukai side, which technically violated the station's scheduling agreement. At the bottom, in the space reserved for notes, Marcus had written payment expected within 30 standard days. Further delays will result in additional administrative charges. He sent it via the standard diplomatic courier channel, formally addressed to Grand Admiral Sorvan, marked as official correspondence from the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, and logged a copy with the Geneva office for the record. The Varukai Intelligence Corps received the message 40 hours later. The senior analyst on duty read it. He read it again. He called 2 colleagues into his office and had them read it. All 3 of them sat quietly for a moment. The senior analyst's name was VTH. He had spent 11 years studying human communication patterns, which was considered a strange specialization within the Varukai intelligence service, but which had over time come to seem increasingly important. He had a wall in his office covered in notes, cross references, translation studies, and cultural analyses, all of which he had built up piece by piece, trying to understand a species that consistently behaved in ways that did not fit the models he had been trained on. He looked at the invoice for a long time. Is it a code? One of his colleagues asked. I don't think so, VTH said. It has to be a code. Why? His colleague gestured at the document. Because what it says, if it is not a code, is that a human envoy responded to our declaration of war by sending us a bill for his lunch. Yes. VTH said, I know what it says. There was another silence. Run it through the encryption analysis, the colleague said. All layers. They did. 6 days later, the encryption analyst confirmed that the document contained no hidden message, no secondary code, no steganographic content of any kind. It was exactly what it appeared to be. The Varukai Intelligence Corps had spent almost a week analyzing an itemized lunch bill. VTH added this to his wall of notes. He wrote a brief summary for the Grand Admiral's intelligence briefing. He included in that summary a section that he knew the Grand Admiral would probably dismiss because it went against everything the Dominion believed about how war worked and how weaker species were supposed to respond to it. He wrote, this behavior is not ignorance. It is not poor translation. It is not a cultural misunderstanding. I have spent 11 years studying humans, and this is consistent. They respond to threats with a kind of practical calm that I do not have a precise Varukai word for. The closest I can find is the word we use for a soldier who has already accepted the worst possible outcome and is therefore no longer afraid of it. But that is not quite right either, because the humans do not seem resigned. They seem, and I recognize this will sound unusual, like they are mildly annoyed at the inconvenience. He paused before adding the last line. Then he added it anyway because he believed in accurate reporting even when the report made people uncomfortable. I recommend we do not assume that what we are seeing is weakness. I have seen no evidence that it is weakness. I have seen considerable evidence that it is something else, and I think we should try very hard to understand what that something else is before we find out the answer through direct experience. Grand Admiral Sorvan read the briefing 2 days later. He read VTH's section twice. He thought about the human at the back table chewing his sandwich. Then he ordered the fleet to continue on its current course because he was a Grand Admiral of the Varukai Dominion, and the Varukai did not change course because a junior analyst thought a lunchtime billing document was interesting. The fleet moved forward. It did not know yet what was waiting for it. But in a small office in the Geneva Diplomatic Tower, Marcus Hale was already 3 weeks into a process that had very little to do with speeches or declarations or formal ceremonies in high-ceiling halls. He was reading cargo manifests, fuel reports, colony evacuation logistics, and long-range sensor data. He was making calls. He was writing lists. He was doing what humans did when they had decided something needed to be handled. He was being thorough. The Varukai fleet crossed into the outer colony sector on the 41st day after the declaration, which was considered very fast by galactic military standards and which the Dominion's War Command had presented to the Emperor as evidence of operational efficiency. 40 warships, the finest in service, commanded by Fleet Marshal Duron, who had won 9 campaigns across 4 star systems, and who wore those victories in the permanent set of his shoulders. The posture of a being who had never once in his long career arrived somewhere and found it not worth arriving at. The outer colonies were a loose string of human settlements across 4 systems. Small places, mostly mining operations, agricultural stations, a few research outposts, combined population of perhaps 3 million, nothing that would strain a fleet of this size. The plan was to take the colonies fast, demonstrate the cost of resisting the Dominion, and use them as a staging ground for the push toward the inner human systems and eventually toward Earth itself. It was a solid plan. Clear's throat. It was the kind of plan that had worked with variations 43 times before. Fleet Marshal Duran brought his ships out of faster than light travel at the edge of the first system. Formation tight, weapons primed, shields active, standard aggressive. Entry, send a clear signal from the first second that resistance was pointless. He looked at his sensor displays. There was nothing there. No defense ships, no patrol craft, no emergency beacon signals from frightened colonists broadcasting surrender on the open channel, no automated defense platforms. The system was quiet in a way that systems were not supposed to be quiet when a fleet had just arrived. There should have been something. Fear, if nothing else. Fear broadcast itself. Scared populations sent signals. They called for help. They tried to negotiate. They did something. System did nothing. Sensors confirm no active vessels in the system. His tactical officer reported no significant energy signatures from the colony sites. Minimal radiation output. Minimal. Duran said the settlements are there. Structures intact but no heat signatures consistent with active habitation. No electromagnetic output from communications. No vehicle traffic. Power grids appear to be offline. Duran looked at the display for a moment. Then he ordered a slow advance and told his tactical team to keep scanning. Fleet moved forward in formation, spread across a wide front, watching for anything that the initial scan might have missed. They missed the mines because the mines had been designed to be missed. They were not large objects. They were not built from exotic materials that might show up on advanced scanners. They were built from the same metals and polymers used in common cargo equipment, because a lot of them had been transported in common cargo equipment, tucked into the holds of freighters, alongside grain shipments and construction materials and the 100 other things that kept small colony stations running. The freighters had passed through the system 3 weeks earlier, during the window between the declaration and the fleet's arrival, moving on their normal routes, stopping at each colony to offload supplies, and while they were there, quietly dropping small clusters of mine units into the dark between the navigation lanes. The mines were patient. They had been programmed to wait for a specific mass, an energy signature profile, the profile of a Varukai warship. The third ship in the second formation column passed over a cluster at a distance of 400 m. The mine's targeting system processed the information. It compared the signature against its stored data. It found a match. Then it told every other mine in its network what it had found and where the other ships were. The next 4 minutes were very bad for the Varukai fleet. Not all the mines hit, perhaps half of them connected with their intended targets, but they were not designed purely to destroy. They were designed to disable, to crack open shield generators, to take out propulsion, to leave ships alive but unable to fight or run. Of the 40 Varukai warships that had entered the system, 11 were destroyed outright, 9 more were badly damaged and falling out of formation. The remaining 20 kept their formation by instinct and training, pulling into a tighter cluster. In the middle of the system, while their commanders tried to understand what had just happened, it took them 40 minutes to fully assess the situation. In those 40 minutes, they sent urgent signals back to Varukai Command and attempted to scan for any human ships that might be in the system. They found nothing. Whatever had delivered those mines was long gone. There were no humans anywhere in the area with weapons hot, no fleet waiting to press an advantage. The mines had done their work, and that was that. Durin, shaken but professional, reorganized his remaining force and pushed toward the nearest colony settlement. If nothing else, he could take the planet. He could secure the infrastructure and show the Dominion's flag. He could make it clear that the Varukai had arrived. Whatever tricks the humans had used to complicate the arrival, the colony was empty, not destroyed, not burned. The buildings were all standing. The roads were intact. The machinery and the processing facility sat in place, all of it wiped clean as if it had been carefully powered down and left. The storage units were empty. The fuel reserves had been drained. The data systems, when Varukai technical teams connected to them, showed nothing. Every drive had been wiped. Every server cleared with a completeness that suggested either significant preparation time or extremely good software, and probably both. The people were simply gone. 300,000 people, and no trace of where they had gone or how quickly they had managed to leave. No abandoned personal items left in panic. No vehicles overturned in a hurry to get out. Just clean, empty buildings in a clean, empty settlement under a clear sky. One of the technical officers found a piece of paper on a kitchen table in what appeared to be a small residential unit near the center of the settlement. It was the only handwritten document found in the entire colony. It said, "Good luck, you're going to need it, M. Hale." The officer photographed it and sent it up the chain of command. Fleet Marshal Durin looked at it for a long time. He did not recognize the name yet. He would later. They burned the colony anyway, because that was the Varukai way. You took what was yours and you marked it as yours, and you left something behind that told the next civilization what had happened to the ones who resisted. 3 more colonies were found in the same state, emptied, wiped, dark. All of them were burned. It felt less like conquest and more like burning furniture that someone had already decided they didn't want anymore. What Durin did not know, what none of the Varukai fleet commanders knew, was that every second of their time in the sector was being watched. Long-range human sensor platforms, small and cold and nearly invisible, had been scattered across the edges of the system weeks before the fleet arrived. They were recording everything: ship positions, formation changes, the exact moment each commander made each decision, the response time between an unexpected event and an order being given, engine output variations that revealed which ships were pushing their systems and which ones had capacity in reserve, weapon yield measurements from every shot fired. Both the mines and the Varukai returned fire against targets that didn't exist. All of this data was streaming in compressed packets on a tight beam channel back toward human Space back to analysts who were building, piece by piece, the most detailed picture of Varukai military capability that had ever existed. Humanity had not run from the outer colonies because it was frightened. It had run because staying would have cost lives for no gain, and because leaving gave them something more useful than a battle won in a system that wasn't strategic. It gave them information, real information, the kind you can only get by watching an enemy operate in the field under pressure, making real decisions. The evacuation had been planned 18 days before the Varukai fleet even left Dominion space. The mine deployment had been planned. Alongside it, the sensor platforms had gone out even earlier, carried by the same freighters that later dropped the mines. None of it had been loud. None of it had been announced. It had simply been done quietly and efficiently by people who had looked at the situation and decided what needed to happen and then made it happen without waiting to be asked twice. In a Varukai intelligence brief filed 3 weeks after the Outer Colonies campaign, a junior analyst named VTH wrote the following line, which was underlined twice in his own handwriting: they did not retreat. They set a trap, gathered their data, and withdrew in good order. Everything the fleet burned was already abandoned. We won nothing except the experience of being watched. Nobody in the Varukai high command fully believed this at the time. It was easier to believe that the humans had panicked and fled and left behind a few surprises on the way out. That was a story that made sense within the frameworks they understood, but VTH believed it, and he kept adding to his wall of notes, and he kept writing his reports, and he kept trying very hard to make his superiors understand what they were dealing with before they found out the slow and painful way. He was, unfortunately, a junior analyst, and the Grand Admiral was still very confident that this was going to go the way these things always went. 6 months into the war, Grand Admiral Sorvan requested a ceasefire meeting. He did not tell his officers why exactly. He said it was a strategic pause. He said it was an opportunity to assess the situation from a position of strength. He used the language of command and confidence because that was the only language Grand Admiral of the Varukai Dominion was permitted to speak in, and because the alternative, telling the truth, which was that the war was going in a direction he did not fully understand, and that this bothered him in a way he had never been bothered before, was not something he had words for. The truth was this: the Varukai were not losing. Not technically, not yet. They had taken territory. They had burned settlements, destroyed infrastructure, pushed the front of the conflict steadily inward toward the human inner systems. On a map, it looked like progress. It looked like the war was going the way wars went when the Dominion was involved, but the numbers were wrong. Every campaign the Dominion had ever run followed a pattern. You apply force, the enemy absorbs it. The enemy weakens. You apply more force, the enemy breaks. The curve was always predictable. You could look at the casualty reports and the supply usage and the territory gained, and you could see the shape of the war, and the shape always bent eventually toward Dominion victory. This war's shape was not bending the right way. Human losses were real. Human colonies had been taken. Human ships had been destroyed. Human positions had been overrun. But each time the Varukai pushed through human defensive position, the cost was higher than it should have been for the Result achieved, ships were being lost to things that shouldn't have been. Threats. Supply depots were going dark. Not destroyed by large attacks, but picked apart by small ones precisely. Targeted, arriving from directions that the Dominion's defensive screens weren't covering, which meant the humans knew where those screens weren't. Jump relays were being disrupted on the Varukai side of the front, slowing resupply and communication, and the disruptions were happening in a sequence that suggested someone was looking at the entire supply network and choosing the most effective order in which to dismantle it. The humans were not fighting the way smaller, weaker forces were supposed to fight. They were not throwing themselves at Varukai's strength. They were ignoring Varukai's strength entirely and finding, with a persistence that was beginning to feel almost personal, every place where there was no strength, and then they were pressing on those places quietly, steadily, without announcement. 3 of Sauron's best fleet commanders had submitted reports in the past 2 months that all said variations of the same thing. We are advancing, but we are paying more than we expected, and we do not fully understand why. This was not something Varukai fleet commanders admitted easily. It was the kind of admission that ended careers in ordinary circumstances. Sauron had not ended their careers because he needed them, and because he privately agreed with them, and because he was beginning to suspect that the answer to the question they were asking was not one he was going to find by pressing forward. Hence the ceasefire meeting. Keith Solara again, the same hall, a much smaller gathering this time. Just the 2 delegations, a neutral station mediator, and a handful of aides. On each side, the station's protocol officer had set the room up with 2 tables facing each other, and a third table along one wall with water and a selection of foods appropriate to both species, which the protocol officer had clearly agonized over and clears throat, which nobody on the Varukai side would be touching. The Varukai delegation arrived first, which was intentional. Sauron wanted to be seated and settled before the human arrived, wanted the visual of a delegation in position and composed, rather than the awkward business of entering a room that the other side was already occupying. He sat at his table in his full ceremonial warplate, his 4 amber eyes calm, his posture the posture of someone who had chosen to have this meeting out of curiosity rather than necessity. Marcus Hale arrived 11 minutes late. He apologized briefly to the station mediator, not to Sauron, on the grounds that the mediator's time had actually been disrupted. He was carrying a container of food. He sat it on the table in front of him, sat down and opened it. It was leftover noodles in a dark sauce. He had apparently brought his lunch from somewhere. Sauron looked at the noodles. For a moment, Marcus looked up, saw the look, and said nothing about it. He simply waited, noodles in front of him, with the expression of someone who had set aside a perfectly reasonable afternoon to be here and was prepared to be professional about it. The Grand Admiral opened the discussion. He spoke about the current state of the conflict. He used the formal phrasing of Varukai military diplomacy, which was structured to convey strength even when the purpose of the meeting was to stop fighting. He talked about the losses on both sides, framing them as evidence of the war's cost rather than the Varukai's difficulty. He talked about the possibility of a negotiated settlement, using a word in High Varukai that translated roughly as arrangement, because the word for settlement carried implications of defeat that he was not prepared to use. He talked for a long time. It was a good speech, he meant. Most of it. When he finished, he asked what humanity wanted in order to end the war. Marcus had been eating his noodles through the second half of the speech. Slowly, without being rude about it, he set down the utensil he'd been using, wiped his mouth with a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, and thought for a moment in the way a person thinks when they already know the answer but want to make sure they say it correctly. Then he told Sauron what Earth wanted. It was three things. First, full financial reparations for the outer colonies, not just the structures burned, but the displacement costs, the economic loss, the administrative cost of the evacuation, and the resettlement. Second, a formal written apology from the Varukai Emperor to be delivered publicly and entered into the galactic diplomatic record. Third, the permanent withdrawal of the Dominion from three specific uninhabited systems in the border region, systems that had no strategic value for the Varukai, no resources worth extracting, nothing of obvious military interest. Those three systems, Marcus explained, were home to a prepient species that was, by the current estimate of human xenobiologists, who had been quietly studying them for 60 years, perhaps 800 years away from developing what might be called genuine civilization. They were interesting creatures. They were not yet capable of asking to be protected. Humanity had decided to ask on their behalf. Sorvan was quiet for a moment after this. Then he said, "That is what you are fighting for." Marcus looked up from recapping the noodle container. "That's what we're willing to stop fighting for," he said. "What we're fighting for is a different matter." Sorvan leaned forward slightly. In Varukai body language, this was a sign of focused attention, the posture a predator takes when it is trying to understand something. "And what are you fighting for?" Marcus considered this with genuine seriousness. He was quiet for a few seconds, not performing thought but actually having it. Then he said, "To be left alone, to have the space to exist without someone deciding that the space we're occupying would look better without us in it." He paused. "That's not a new thing for us to want. We've been wanting it for a long time." The room was quiet. One of the Varukai aides shifted slightly in his seat. The station mediator of Elhari, who had been carefully maintaining neutral expression for the last hour, glanced once at Marcus and then looked back at the table. Sorvan said, "The Emperor will not accept these terms." "I know," Marcus said. He didn't sound surprised or discouraged. He sounded like a man who had expected that answer and had already thought past it. "But I wanted you to hear them from me directly, so that when we reach the point where the Emperor changes his mind, there's no confusion about what we actually asked." For there was a long pause. "You believe he will change his mind?" Sorvan said. "I think it becomes more likely over time." Marcus said simply, "That's usually how it works." He closed the noodle container, tucked it under his arm, and stood up. He offered Sorvan the formal two-handed acknowledgement that the Varukai used to close a meeting between equals, which he had clearly studied and practiced because he did it correctly. Then he nodded to the mediator and walked out of the room. Sorvan sat at his table for a while after the human left. He had come to this meeting expecting to measure the enemy, to read the body language and the tone and the desperation that was usually present in a weaker civilization 6 months into a losing war, to understand what they needed badly enough to accept unfavorable terms for it. He had not expected to leave the meeting less certain than when he arrived. He had not expected to sit here with the quiet feeling that he had just spoken to someone who was in some way he couldn't precisely identify, not afraid of him at all, not performing calm, not pretending, just not afraid, as if fear of the Varukai simply wasn't part of the calculation. He told himself this was arrogance, human arrogance, ignorance dressed up as confidence. He looked at the empty table where the human had been sitting. The noodle container was gone. There was a small smudge on the surface where it had been placed, and that was all. Sorvan returned to his ship and ordered the fleet to continue operations. He sent word back to the Emperor that the ceasefire meeting had produced no agreement. He did not include in his official report the part where he had sat alone in the meeting room for 11 minutes after the human left, trying to figure out what exactly he had seen in the man's eyes and why it made him feel, for the first time in 43 campaigns, like he should be careful. The Varukai did not accept the terms, not right away. Pride was a heavy thing to put down, especially for an empire that had never had to put it down before. The Emperor issued a formal rejection of the human proposal, which was read aloud in the Dominion's Great Assembly Hall to a crowd of generals and ministers who responded with the ritual affirmations that the occasion required the war would continue. The Varukai did not negotiate from weakness. The Varukai did not negotiate at all if they could help it. They resolved things, and resolution meant one side winning and the other side accepting what that meant. So the war continued, but something had changed after the ceasefire meeting, and the change was not in humanity's position. Humanity's position was what it had been since the beginning: methodical, patient, and getting incrementally more effective with every passing week. As the data gathered in those early months was processed and turned into better targeting, better timing, better decisions about where to press and where to give ground, the change was in the Varukai, not all of them. Clear's throat, not the soldiers or the fleet crews who fought hard and well, because that was what they were trained to do, not the Emperor, who was insulated by his court from anything that might disturb his confidence, but in the middle layer, the logistics commanders, the intelligence analysts, the supply chain officers, the people whose job it was to look at numbers and make sure that numbers made sense. A quiet and deeply uncomfortable awareness was growing. The awareness was this: the war was costing more than it was returning, and the gap was growing. Jump relays kept going dark, and repairing them cost ships and time and materials that were supposed to be allocated to the front. Fuel depots that had been established in secured territory kept being raided, not overrun, not destroyed, just quietly emptied or damaged in ways that required weeks of repair. Communication lines between fleet commands were disrupted on a rotating schedule that suggested the humans had mapped the entire Varukai communication network and were playing it like an instrument, muting one section at a time just long enough to create confusion before moving to the next. Human forces captured instead of killing when it served them. Varukai prisoners were held in conditions that met the standards of a treaty that the Varukai had never signed, but that humanity applied anyway because, as one captured Varukai officer later testified, their guards had explained with genuine seriousness that it was simply the right way to do things. Prisoners were fed, they were given medical care, they were kept informed of the broad outlines of the war's progress in a way that was factual and not gloating. This was more disturbing to Varukai command than any act of violence would have been. You could hate an enemy who mistreated your people. You could build that hatred into something useful. It was much harder to know what to do with an enemy who treated your captured soldiers with basic decency and seemed entirely unbothered about it. Across the Varukai Dominion's internal communication networks, a series of educational documentary programs began broadcasting on hijacked channels. The documentaries were about human history. They were not propaganda exactly. They did not argue that the Varukai should surrender, did not show human soldiers in heroic poses, did not make any particular point beyond the point that was already inherent in the content. The content was this: here is what happened to humanity over several thousand years. Here is what tried to destroy them. Here are the names of the empires and the disasters and the things that came close. And here is what happened to those things in the end. Documentaries ran for about 40 minutes. Each, they were professionally made, clearly narrated and factually accurate. The Varukai Intelligence Service identified them as psychological operations and moved to block the signals, which worked for a few days at a time before new channels were found. VTH, watching this happen from his office, did not bother writing another report. He just added a note to his wall that said, "They are not trying to frighten us. They are trying to inform us. This is different, and I think we should treat it as different." 7 months after the ceasefire meeting, the Emperor received a private report from the Dominion's Chief Logistics Minister. The minister was a careful, cautious being who had served 4 emperors and who had never once in 30 years of service submitted a report that contained the phrase, "I am formally recommending a change in strategic direction." The report now contained that phrase. It contained it twice. The minister had laid out in very clear and unemotional terms what the current trajectory of the war meant for the Dominion's economic and military capacity over the next 3 to 5 years. The numbers were not catastrophic yet, but they were trending in a direction that, if allowed to continue, would become catastrophic, and the minister had attached a projection chart that made this very easy to see. The Emperor read the report. He read the projection chart. He sat with it for 2 days. Then he called Grand Admiral Sorvan. Sarin, for his part, did not argue. He had been waiting for this call for 2 months. He had his own reports, his own projections, his own quietly growing understanding of what the humans were doing and how long they could keep doing it. He made 3 recommendations to the Emperor. The Emperor accepted all 3. 2 weeks later, a formal communication went out through the neutral channels to the United Earth Diplomatic Corps. The Varukai were prepared to discuss terms. The signing ceremony took place at Keth Solara in the same hall as the declaration, which was either poetic or simply practical, depending on who you asked. The Varukai delegation arrived in full ceremonial dress. There were speeches, shorter ones this time, from Both sides, which the station mediator appreciated, the agreement was read aloud in both languages. The reparations figure was large but not punishing. The apology was formal and carefully worded, which was the Varukai's way of making it as painless as possible while still being real. The 3-star systems were designated protected space under a framework that both sides had spent 2 weeks negotiating, and that humans would spend the next several decades actually enforcing, because enforcement was the part that mattered and they knew it. Marcus Hale signed on behalf of Earth. He used a pen that had a small cartoon rocket on the clip. It was the pen that happened to be in his jacket pocket, and he did not feel the need to use a different one for the occasion. He signed his name cleanly, capped the pen, and put it back in his pocket. Varukai delegation signed in their own way, which involved a formal seal rather than a written signature applied by Sorvan himself with a steadiness that gave away nothing of what he was thinking. It was done. The hall began to clear. Aides collected documents. The mediator spoke quietly with both delegation heads. People moved toward the exits in the shuffling, slightly tired way that people move when something formal has finally concluded and they are processing that it's over. Near the door, a young Varukai aide stopped beside Marcus Hale. He was junior enough that he shouldn't have approached a foreign envoy directly without going through proper channels, but something in the day had loosened the usual protocols, and he seemed to be operating on impulse rather than procedure. Envoy Hale, he said. His translator rendered his voice into careful, accented human standard. I have a question, if it is not too informal. Marcus looked at him. He had the look of someone who was not going to make the young aide feel foolish for asking. Go ahead. On the day of the declaration, the aide said, the day in this room, when the Grand Admiral read the terms, what did you feel in that moment? He paused. Were you frightened? Marcus was quiet for a moment, not a deflecting quiet, but a thinking quiet. He looked toward the back corner of the hall where his side table had been on that day, and his expression was the expression of someone genuinely trying to give an accurate answer to a genuine question. Humanity has been declared war on before, he said, by things that were honestly a lot more frightening than the Varukai. No offense meant. He said this without any cruelty, as a statement of fact. We've been invaded and occupied. We've nearly been wiped out in half the time. We nearly did it to ourselves. We've had diseases that killed a third of entire continents. We've had wars that lasted generations, not campaigns, but actual wars, 100 years of fighting, and we came out the other side of them, and we kept going. He was quiet for a second. So no, I wasn't frightened. I was a little sad, maybe, because I've read enough history to know how it ends when an empire decides it wants to go to war with a people who have already learned how to survive themselves. He looked at the young aide, and his look was not unkind. It ends the same way every time, and there's always a moment somewhere in the middle of it where the empire realizes what it's actually gotten into, and by then it's already too late to go back to where it started. The aide was quiet. He looked at the floor, then back up. The Grand Admiral, he said slowly, said, you were not afraid because you did not understand the threat. I know, Marcus said. He nodded gently. He was working with the information he had. He said goodbye to the aide and walked out of the Oh. His footsteps were the same as they had always been, even unhurried. The steps of a man who had somewhere to be in enough time to get there, across the galaxy, in the intelligence offices and embassy rooms and quiet war rooms of 100 watching civilizations. Analysts filed their final reports on the conflict. The reports varied in language and framing, but the conclusions were remarkably consistent. They said in one way or another the same thing. Humanity does not panic. Humanity does not beg. They will finish their meal, file their paperwork, gather their data, and then with a patience that has no clear endpoint, they will take apart everything you built. They will do it without anger, without cruelty, without even appearing to hurry. And when it is done, they will sign the agreement with whatever pen happens to be in their pocket and go home. This is not something that can be defeated by strength alone. Strength assumes the other side is afraid of it. Humanity is not afraid of it. They have been through worse. They remember, and they are still here in a small protected region of space on a warm, quiet planet orbiting yellow star, a species that had no name for itself, yet moved through shallow water and climbed the rocky shores and looked up at the night sky with eyes that were just beginning to wonder what was out there. They had 800 years before they would have words for the question, but the answer, thanks to a flatbread sandwich and a man who refused to put it down, was already waiting for